The fluorescent lights inside the Trenton military working dog retirement facility hummed with the kind of indifference that only government buildings seem capable of. Outside, it was February, the real kind of February that southern Ontario gets when it decides to stop being polite. The wind off Lake Ontario had teeth. The parking lot was full of pickup trucks and fleet vehicles, and the men who climbed out of them wore the kind of expressions that said they had done this before and expected to do it again. Nobody was paying attention to the woman who pulled in last. She drove a 10-year-old Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a Canadian Armed Forces memorial sticker on the back window, the kind with the maple leaf and a set of dog tags hanging from it. She sat in the car for a moment after she shut off the engine, just sat there, hand still on the steering wheel, looking at the building like she was deciding something. Then she pulled a manila envelope from the passenger seat, tucked it under her arm, and got out. Her name was Siobhan Mercer. She was 26 years old. She had driven 4 hours from Petawawa in a car that needed new tires, with exactly $2,300 in a credit union account and a letter she had written and rewritten 11 times since October. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had already done the hardest thing she was ever going to do, and everything after that was just logistics. The facility was not what most people imagined when they thought about retired military dogs. There were no green lawns, no wide runs where animals could stretch their legs in the sun. It was a converted D&D holding facility. Cinder-block walls painted the color of old putty, chain-link enclosures running the length of the east wing, fluorescent overheads that buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of annoyance. The air smelled like disinfectant and animal, and something underneath both of those things that was harder to name. The auction had been listed on a government surplus disposal notice. That was how it was described. Surplus disposal. The animals had been assessed, cleared for civilian adoption, and would be offered to registered bidders at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning in February, lot by lot, until they were gone. The man running the process was a civilian contractor named Gerald Offey. He had a clipboard and a radio clipped to his belt, and the air of someone who managed logistics for a living, and had long since stopped thinking about what the logistic contained. He checked Siobhan's registration when she came through the door, looked at her twice, and said nothing. The other bidders were already gathered near the east wing doors. There were 11 of them. 3 were private security contractors who handled perimeter patrol for industrial facilities. They were there for working animals, trained, obedient, already operationally useful. 2 were representatives from a dog training organization in Barrie. One man who stood slightly apart from the others and wore a Carhartt jacket over a chambray shirt had driven up from Niagara and said very little to anyone. The rest were a mix. Retired law enforcement, 1 municipal K9 coordinator, a woman from a veteran animal rescue non-profit out of Halifax who had flown in the night before. Siobhan was the youngest person in the room by at least 15 years. She stood near the back and kept the manila envelope flat against her side and did not introduce herself. The animals were brought out in sequence. Gerald Off read from his clipboard in a flat, practiced voice. Designation, breed, age, service history, medical clearance status, assessed temperament. Then bidding opened. It was efficient. It was almost entirely without ceremony. The first 3 dogs sold quickly. A Belgian Malinois to the security firm, a German Shepherd to the K9 coordinator, a Labrador retrieval and detection animal to the Halifax non-profit. There was a rhythm to it. Numbers were called. Paddles went up. Gerald recorded the results and moved on. Lot 7 was different. Gerald paused before he read from the clipboard. It was brief, barely a second, but it was there. Lot 7, he said. Male, Belgian Malinois, 8 years old. Designated warrant. Certified MWD, Special Operations Support, 11 deployments over 6 years of active service. He stopped, cleared his throat, retired on medical and behavioral grounds. Currently assessed as high drive, handler selective, not recommended for general civilian placement. The doors at the far end of the corridor opened. It took 3 people to bring him out. 2 handlers worked the catch poles, heavy duty, the kind used for animals that cannot be leashed conventionally, and a 3rd walked alongside with a control lead clipped to a tactical harness. The dog at the end of those poles was large, even for the breed. His coat was the dark fawn and black of a working Malinois, but his face told a different story than his body. A pale scar ran from the base of his left ear down across his muzzle, and his right flank showed a patch of fur that had never grown back quite right, uneven, slightly raised along the edge of an old wound that had been stitched in the field. One of his canine teeth was partially broken and had been filed smooth. He moved with the controlled intensity of an animal that was not panicking, but was also not passive. His head was low. His ears tracked every person in the room in quick, deliberate sweeps. When the handlers stopped him in the open space at the center of the corridor, he planted his feet and held absolutely still, and that stillness was somehow more unsettling than movement would have been. The room had gone quiet. Medical history includes shrapnel injury to the right flank, 1 shoulder dislocation, partial hearing loss in the left ear, Gerald continued, though his voice had dropped slightly. Current handler assessed the animal as non-transferable. Civilian integration not recommended by the handling team. He lowered the clipboard. Bidding opens at 500. Nobody moved. Siobhan watched the dog. She had known his name before she walked in the door. She had known his designation number, his service record, his medical file, as much of it as she'd been able to obtain through the requests she had filed over the past 8 months, through the phone calls, through the letter she had written to the regimental sergeant major, through the conversation she'd finally had with her father's last patrol partner, Corporal Yusuf Adeyemi, who had called her from Kandahar on a bad connection and said, "He saved your dad's life twice before your dad saved his. You need to get that dog." She raised her paddle. 500, Gerald said. Do I have 6? One of the security contractors lifted his hand. Not enthusiastically, more like a reflex. 607, Siobhan said. The contractor looked at her for the first time. He had the kind of face that was accustomed to making quick assessments and reaching quick conclusions. 8, he said. There were things about Warrant that Siobhan knew and things she didn't. She knew that his handler for the last 4 years had been Master Corporal Ryan Mercer, her father. She knew that her father had deployed with Warrant 3 times, had written about him in his letters home, with the particular mix of professionalism and suppressed affection that soldiers use when they are talking about animals they are not supposed to be attached to. He works hard, her father had written, doesn't quit, doesn't make noise about things. I trust him more than I trust most people, and I think he knows it. She knew that Warrant had been with her father when the IED detonated on the Panjwai Road in April, 2.5 years ago. She knew that Warrant had been treated at the Forward Operating Base Veterinary Station, that he had been cleared and redeployed, and that sometime in the 18 months after that, he had become what his assessment file described as handler selective to the point of operational limitation, and had been rotated back to Canada and eventually transferred to the Trenton facility. What Siobhan didn't know, what she had turned over and over in her mind during the drive down, during the nights she couldn't sleep, during every version of the letter she had written, was whether Warrant remembered, whether the piece of him that had been formed by her father was still in there, underneath the scar and the wariness and the official assessment of not recommended for civilian placement. She didn't know, but she had come anyway. 900, the contractor said. 1,000, said the man from Niagara. Siobhan hadn't expected him. She turned. He was watching the dog, not her. He had his arms crossed, and his expression was the careful neutral of someone who had already done the math on what they were willing to spend. He glanced at her once, and something shifted in his face, just slightly, the way a person's expression shifts when they recalibrate a situation. And then he looked back at Warrant. 1200, Siobhan said. The room was quiet except for the dog's breathing and the low hum of the fluorescence. Gerald looked at the Niagara man. The man looked at Siobhan. He looked at the envelope under her arm. He looked at her father's memorial sticker that she had pulled off the Civic before she came in and tucked into the back of the envelope, because she thought she might need it. He couldn't have known that. He was just looking. 13, he said, quieter. 1500, Siobhan said. One of the handlers shifted her weight. The dog's ears moved, not toward Siobhan, not toward anything specific, just moving, tracking, the constant, low-level alertness of an animal that had never learned to fully stand down. Gerald waited. 16, said the contractor from 4, flat and automatic, like a man who had a budget and intended to use it. 2000, Siobhan said. The contractor shook his head and lowered his paddle. Done. The Niagara man was still watching her. His jaw was tight. 2100, he said. Siobhan opened the manila envelope. She took out the letter, the 11th draft, printed on plain white paper with the regimental crest at the top that Corporal Adeyemi had scanned and sent to her. She held it up, not toward Gerald, but toward the room. She wasn't performing. Her hand was not entirely steady. I'm Ryan Mercer's daughter, she said. That's his dog. The room changed. It changed the way a room changes when someone says something that reorders the logic of the space. When the thing that was an auction becomes something else and everyone present has to decide in real time how they feel about that. Gerald Offey stopped writing on his clipboard. The Halifax non-profit woman put her paddle down on the edge of a kennel door without seeming to notice she was doing it. The Niagara man's expression did something complicated. He looked at the letter in Siobhan's hand. He looked at the dog. He stood there for a moment with his paddle at his side, and then, without bidding again, without speaking, he set the paddle down on the floor beside him and stepped back. It was the security contractor who spoke first. 2000. 100 going once, he said, not to Gerald. It wasn't really directed at anyone. It was more like thinking out loud. Withdrawn, the Niagara man said quietly. To Gerald, formally, I withdraw my bid. The contractor looked at him, then at Siobhan, then at Warrant, who had turned his head. And this was the thing that nobody in the room had expected. Warrant had turned his head towards Siobhan. Not a trained response, not a handler cue. He had simply turned and was looking at her the way a dog looks at something it is trying to understand. Head angled slightly, ears forward, completely still. Gerald cleared his throat. $2,000, he said, going once. Siobhan had been told, very clearly, by the facility's intake coordinator when she had called in January, that she would not be permitted to approach Warrant during the auction. That was protocol. High-drive animals, unknown civilians. The liability alone was prohibitive. She had been told that if she won the bid, there would be a mandatory 48-hour hold, a civilian transition assessment, a handler introduction in a controlled environment, and that the earliest she could take the animal home would be the following Tuesday. She had agreed to all of it. She stood 6 feet away from Warrant now, in the East Corridor, with Gerald and 2 handlers and the facility's head of animal operations, a retired master warrant officer named Carl Tremaine, who had been watching the auction from the doorway and had stepped forward when Siobhan put the letter on the table. Tremaine was the only person in the room who had known her father. He hadn't said anything about that yet. He was just standing there, arms crossed, watching the dog. Warrant was not reacting the way the handlers had expected. He was not pulling against the catch poles. He was not vocalizing. He was standing approximately 4 feet from Siobhan with his body oriented toward her, his breathing audible but controlled, his eyes tracking her face with the fixed, deliberate attention of an animal that is working something out. "You can speak to him," Tremaine said. "Keep your voice level. Don't reach out." Siobhan had not planned what she was going to say. She had planned a lot of things. The letter, the paperwork, the drive, the money, but she had not planned this part, because she had not let herself imagine getting this far. She said her father's name, not as an introduction, not as a command. She said it the way you say something out loud when you are finally allowing yourself to say it. Just the name, Ryan, in the same tone her father used when he was talking about something he cared about. Warrant went still. He had already been still. But this was different. The kind of stillness that isn't the absence of movement, but the presence of attention that is so complete. It looks like the animal has stopped breathing. His ears came fully forward. His head dropped fractionally. And then, for just a moment, the posture shifted, the tension in his back legs released by a fraction, and something moved across his face that the handlers would later describe, in their professional assessment notes, simply as recognition response. Tremaine uncrossed his arms. Nobody spoke. The 48-hour hold became 24 by Tuesday afternoon. Tremaine had signed off on it himself. He had also, without being asked, arranged for the facility's civilian transition kennel, a quieter room at the back of the building, away from the auction corridor, to be used for Siobhan's introductory sessions with Warrant. She came both days. She brought a worn canvas field jacket that had been her father's. She'd found it at the back of his closet when she was cleaning out his apartment in Petawawa, folded under a shelf, smelling like him and like something else, something that was hard to place. She didn't wear it. She left it folded on the bench outside the kennel door and didn't say anything to anyone about it. On the first afternoon, Warrant sat at the back of the kennel and watched her. On the second morning, he moved to the middle. By the second afternoon, he was at the kennel door when she arrived, standing, ears forward. On the third day, Tremaine walked her through the basic commands, the ones her father had used, the ones that were in the handling notes that Siobhan had read so many times she had them memorized. Fuss, Platz, here, the German commands that military working dogs are trained with, specific sounds that belong to a specific language, a specific context, a specific person. When she said here, Warrant walked to her and sat at her left side. The handler behind the observation window stopped writing. Tremaine said nothing for a moment. Then, he hasn't done that with anyone here, not once, not in 8 months. Siobhan put her hand on Warrant's head. He didn't flinch. He leaned, just slightly, the way a large dog leans when it is allowing itself the weight of contact, and stayed there. She drove back to Petawawa on Thursday morning with Warrant in the back seat. He took the whole seat. He didn't pace or whine or press against the window. He lay flat, head on his paws, and watched the Ontario highway unspool behind them through the rear windshield. Once, somewhere past Belleville, he shifted and put his chin on the back of Siobhan's seat, close to her shoulder, and kept it there for a long time. She didn't say anything. She just drove. The apartment she had was small, a two-bedroom in a low-rise off Festubert Street that she'd taken after she moved back from Halifax when her father died. It had a kitchen that got afternoon light and a back garden that her landlord, a former gunner named Frank Kowalek, had never done anything with and didn't mind if she did. She had put nothing in the garden. She had until recently put very little in either room. She brought Warrant inside and unclipped his leash and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him move through the apartment for the first time. He was deliberate about it. He went room by room, not frantically, not anxiously, but with the thorough, systematic attention of a dog that is assessing an environment. He checked the perimeter of each room. He stood in the doorway of the second bedroom. Her father's things were in there, boxed, the things she hadn't been able to deal with yet, and stayed there for a long time before he moved on. Then he came back to the kitchen. He sat down in front of Siobhan and looked at her. "Okay," she said. It was the only thing she could think of to say. He lay down with his chin on his paws and watched the afternoon light come through the kitchen window. The first month was not easy. Siobhan had done her research. She had read everything she could find about high-drive working dogs transitioning to civilian life. the sleep disruption, the hypervigilance, the difficulty with unstructured time. She had spoken to 2 handlers, a veterinary behaviorist in Ottawa, and a woman who ran a working dog retirement program in Guelph, who had talked to her for 90 minutes on a Sunday and said, at the end of it, "You're going to have hard days. That's fine. Just don't let him think you're scared, because he'll try to manage it, and that will make him worse." There were hard days. There were nights when Warrant didn't sleep, when he paced the apartment in slow circuits, checking the windows, checking the door, lying down for 20 minutes, and then rising again. There were days when he was fine, and days when something, a sound outside, a change in routine, the particular quality of light on a certain kind of afternoon, seemed to land on him wrong, and he would go still and watchful in a way that was hard to read from the outside. Siobhan didn't push. She learned the rhythm of him the way you learn the rhythm of a person you're living with, the small signals, the tells, the difference between alert and anxious, between watchful and distressed. She started running in the mornings. Warrant came. He ran at her left shoulder with the precision of a dog that had spent years training in exactly that position. And he didn't pull and he didn't lag. And after the first week, she stopped using the leash on the trail behind the base housing, and he stayed at her side without it. Frank Kowalek saw them from his kitchen window one morning and came out to the back step and watched them come back from the trail. "That's a working dog," he said. "He is," Siobhan said. "Whose?" She considered the question for a moment. "Mine now." Frank looked at Warrant. Warrant looked at Frank with the steady assessing attention he applied to everything. "What's his name?" "Warrant." Frank nodded slowly. "Good name," he said, and went back inside. There was a phone call in March from Gerald Offey at the Trenton facility. He was calling to confirm that the civilian transition had been completed and close the file. Standard follow-up. "He's doing well," Siobhan told him. There was a pause on the line. Then Gerald said unexpectedly, "I wasn't sure about that auction, for that particular animal." Another pause. "I'm glad you came." She thanked him and hung up and sat for a moment at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand. Warrant was in the doorway. He came and lay down under the table, close to her feet. She had a photograph of her father on the table, not framed, just a print she'd gotten made from her phone, the one taken at CFB Valcartier the summer, before his last deployment. He was squinting against the sun. He was laughing at something off camera. He looked like himself, which sounds like an obvious thing to say about a photograph, but is in fact the hardest thing to achieve. She put her hand down and Warrant put his chin on it. They stayed like that for a while. In April, Siobhan went back to work. She was a paramedic, had been since she was 22, and the leave she'd taken after her father's death had stretched longer than she'd intended. Her partner was a woman named Beth Allowine, who had known Ryan Mercer slightly through the base community, and who said nothing about any of it on Siobhan's first shift back, and everything about it on the second, which was exactly the right order. The thing about going back to work was that Warrant had to manage the apartment alone for 12 hours at a stretch. She had thought about this. She had spoken to the behaviorist. She had done everything that was recommended. Exercise before the shift, a Kong with frozen food inside, a specific blanket, the radio on low. She left the second bedroom door open. She came home after the first shift expecting to find something. Chewed furniture, anxious pacing, some signal of a hard day. Warrant was asleep in the second bedroom. He had pulled the canvas field jacket, the one she had brought to the facility, which she had eventually brought home, and left folded on the shelf in that room, off the shelf and onto the floor. He was sleeping with his chin on it. Siobhan stood in the doorway for a long time. She did not try to be quiet. She let him hear her. After a moment, he lifted his head, looked at her, and settled back down with the same unhurried solidity of an animal that knows where it is and knows it is not going anywhere. She sat down on the floor in the doorway, back against the frame. "Okay, buddy," she said softly. "Okay." Outside, the April light was going thin and gold across the rooftops, and somewhere on Festubert Street a kid was riding a bike in slow circles, and the whole neighborhood had the loose, tentative feel of a Canadian spring that has finally decided to mean it. Warrant didn't move. His breathing was slow and even. Siobhan sat there until it was dark, and then she got up and made dinner, and he came and lay under the kitchen table the way he always did, and they were quiet together, which was, she had come to understand, its own kind of language, one her father had learned first, and passed on in the only way that remained. Not in words, not in instructions, in a dog who knew how to stay.